Admiral Ezekiel Grant, a distinguished Black Navy admiral, was known for his impeccable service and leadership. He had spent years serving his country with honor, navigating through some of the most difficult missions with unwavering dedication. It was this commitment and sacrifice that earned him a respected position in the military, and he had achieved everything a man could dream of in his career. Today, he was preparing for yet another important mission, one that required him to travel across the world for strategic discussions. As Admiral Grant arrived at the airport, everything seemed to be going according to plan. He was greeted with the usual respect, but there was something unusual about this trip. The flight was an international one, a long journey that would take many hours, and like many important figures, he was accustomed to flying first class. It wasn't a matter of luxury. It was about comfort and the long hours he would need to be at his best when he arrived at his destination. However, as he stood at the check-in counter, something unexpected happened. The airline attendant, who had initially greeted him with a polite smile, suddenly looked a bit uncertain. She began typing furiously into her computer, her brow furrowing as she checked the system. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," she said with an apologetic tone. "There seems to be an issue with your seat. It's not available." Admiral Grant was taken aback for a moment. "What do you mean it's not available?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with confusion. He had confirmed the seat and received his boarding pass earlier, so this was completely unexpected. The attendant hesitated, glancing at her screen again. "It seems there's been a system error. We don't have a first-class seat for you at the moment. I'm afraid we've downgraded you to economy class." The word stung, but Admiral Grant's expression didn't change. His mind raced as he thought about the countless hours he had spent on duty, the sweat, and the sacrifices. His rank and years of experience had earned him certain privileges, yet in this moment, those privileges seemed to mean nothing. But he was a leader, trained to keep his composure, and so he simply nodded. "I'll take the seat," he replied, his voice steady. The attendant looked unsure, clearly not expecting such an easy acceptance from someone of his stature. "I can try to make some adjustments, sir," she offered. "Perhaps we can find a better seat for you in first class." Admiral Grant gave her a gentle smile, one that reassured her. "No need. I'll sit where you've assigned me." He took his boarding pass and walked toward the security check, trying to shake off the discomfort of the situation. As he passed through the terminal, the other passengers didn't seem to notice his disappointment. They were all lost in their own worlds, but Admiral Grant couldn't help but think about the irony of it all. After all the battles he had fought, the diplomacy he had negotiated, and the people he had led, here he was forced to sit in a cramped economy seat. Despite the injustice of it, he didn't let his feelings show. He simply walked calmly to his seat and sat down. The plane would soon take off, and the journey would continue. Yet in that moment, something inside him shifted. It wasn't the first time he had been treated unfairly, but it was a stark reminder that even those who had earned the highest respect could still be overlooked. This was just the beginning of a journey that would change the atmosphere on that flight. What started as a simple seat assignment would soon spark something much bigger, something that would surprise everyone aboard. And in the end, it would be a story told for years to come. As the flight started and the plane climbed into the sky, the atmosphere inside the cabin was relaxed, with passengers chatting quietly and settling into their seats. The steady hum of the engines filled the air, and many people looked out of the windows, enjoying the view. But Admiral Ezekiel Grant sat quietly in his seat, his thoughts far from the scenery outside. He glanced around at the other passengers, none of whom seemed to have noticed the slight he had experienced. He was used to being in the spotlight in some ways, but this time, he was just one person in a sea of travelers, no different from anyone else in the eyes of the airline staff. In the cockpit, Captain Adam West was preparing for the long flight ahead. He was a seasoned pilot with many years of experience, and he had flown all over the world, carrying passengers on missions just like this one. But there was something different about today's flight. When the airline staff had initially briefed him about the seating issue, his mind had immediately gone to the name on the passenger list. Admiral Grant, he thought, recognizing the name instantly. He had attended a few military functions where the Admiral had been a guest speaker, and he knew the importance of the man who was now seated in economy class. Captain West had heard the rumors about the treatment of high-ranking officials by some airlines, but seeing it firsthand made it feel all the more real. He knew that the Admiral had spent decades in service, fighting for his country, yet here he was, quietly settling for a seat in the back of the plane. Like any other ordinary passenger, it wasn't right, and Captain West couldn't ignore it. It bothered him on a deep level, especially since he had always believed that those who served in the military deserved the utmost respect, no matter where they came from or what color their skin was. As the flight continued, Captain West couldn't shake the image of Admiral Grant sitting alone in economy. He understood the professionalism and calm that the Admiral had displayed, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed wrong. He couldn't stand by and let this injustice pass without doing something about it. He had the power to make a difference in that moment, and he wasn't going to let the opportunity slip away. During a routine check-in with the cabin crew, Captain West overheard one of the flight attendants discussing the issue with another passenger. The attendant mentioned that the Admiral had been downgraded from first class to economy due to a mistake in the system. This made Captain West's resolve even stronger. He decided that he would take action. He wasn't going to just let it slide. The pilot returned to the cockpit briefly, but the thoughts of the Admiral kept tugging at him. As the hours ticked by, Captain West made his decision. He would make an announcement that would not only acknowledge the Admiral's presence on the flight, but also stand as a quiet act of solidarity for all those who had ever been treated unfairly. It wasn't just about the seating arrangement. It was about showing respect for the man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, no matter how others might view him. Soon, it was time for the announcement. The plane's engines hummed steadily as Captain West's voice came over the intercom, calm but clear. What he would say next would surprise everyone on board, including Admiral Grant. But for now, the Admiral remained unaware of the change in the air, quietly lost in his own thoughts as the flight continued on its path through the sky. As the hours passed, the hum of the plane's engines became a steady background noise. But in the cabin, something shifted. The passengers had settled into their routines, some reading, others sleeping, and a few chatting with one another. Yet there was an underlying current of unease that seemed to have spread, though few could pinpoint its exact source. It wasn't just the usual monotony of a long flight. There was something different today. It was as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Admiral Ezekiel Grant, sitting quietly in his economy seat, felt a quiet restlessness creeping in. He had always been someone who thrived in action, someone who felt most alive in the midst of challenges. Yet here, in this sterile, crowded cabin, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his name, he felt a sense of disconnect. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way. He had seen it in different forms throughout his career, the subtle ways in which people were overlooked or underestimated. But today, it was different. The slight, though small, had made him reflect on how easily those in power could be ignored. What bothered him the most, however, was that he had let it slide without protest. For years, he had faced challenges, but he had always pushed back, always fought for what he deserved. Yet here he was, a high-ranking officer in the Navy, quietly accepting the fact that his rightful seat had been given away. He felt a flicker of something, a quiet anger, a desire for justice, but he swallowed it down. There was no point in making a scene. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He was here to do his job, to lead, no matter where he was seated. But there was another part of him that couldn't ignore the feeling of disappointment. He had earned every step of his career, each rank, each medal, and each moment of recognition. But here, on this flight, it all felt like it meant nothing. No matter how many accolades he had earned, it was clear that some people still didn't respect him, simply because of who he was. As these thoughts weighed heavily on him, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. The flight attendants were moving quickly down the aisles, whispering among themselves, and he could see that their expressions had shifted from routine politeness to something more concerned. The murmurs started to grow louder, and a few passengers turned their heads to look at one another, sensing that something was not quite right. In the cockpit, Captain Adam West could feel the tension too. His gaze occasionally flicked toward the back of the plane, where Admiral Grant was sitting. He could sense the unspoken shift in the air. It was not just the presence of the Admiral that had caught his attention. It was the injustice that had been done to him. As the flight continued, Captain West knew he couldn't sit by any longer. The sense of respect he had for the Admiral made it clear something needed to be done. The time had come to make his move. Captain West, who had been thinking about this for hours, finally decided to act. He felt that the best way to address the situation was not with anger or confrontation, but with a quiet, powerful gesture. It wasn't about drawing attention to the wrong that had been done. It was about showing solidarity and respect. The flight attendants had been whispering amongst themselves, but now they were ready to act, to support what the captain was about to do. The calm and collected voice of Captain West came over the intercom, and the passengers immediately fell silent. The quiet hum of the plane seemed to fade as every ear turned toward the speaker. What he said next would change the mood on the plane, even if no one knew it yet. But Admiral Grant, still lost in his thoughts, couldn't anticipate the ripple effect that would soon sweep through the cabin. The next moments were about to unfold in a way that no one expected. As the soft hum of the engines filled the air, the passengers on the plane were lost in their own worlds. Some were reading, others chatting quietly, and a few dozed off, trying to pass the time on the long flight. Yet, for all of them, a subtle shift in the atmosphere began to take shape. It was quiet at first, barely noticeable, but soon a sense of anticipation lingered in the air, as if something was about to happen. The passengers couldn't quite put their finger on it, but they could feel that something was different today. Admiral Ezekiel Grant, still seated in economy class, had leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as he tried to find a moment of peace. Despite the unease he felt about the seating arrangement, he remained calm, keeping his thoughts to himself. He had seen much in his career, faced countless challenges, and dealt with far greater injustices. So, in many ways, this moment felt like just another minor setback, something he could rise above. But deep down, there was a flicker of frustration. He had earned his place in the world, fought for it, and yet here he was, overlooked and disregarded. Captain Adam West, on the other hand, sat in the cockpit, his mind racing. He had spent years in the Navy, had seen many situations unfold, but this one weighed on him more than others. Seeing Admiral Grant, a man who had done so much for his country, being treated as just another passenger was a sting that Captain West couldn't ignore. He felt a growing need to do something, to make things right in whatever way he could. But how? The solution wasn't obvious, and the last thing he wanted to do was make things worse. He needed to do something that would make an impact without causing a scene, without making the situation more difficult for the Admiral. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, Captain West made up his mind. He would use his position not to draw attention to the wrong that had been done, but to express his respect and appreciation for Admiral Grant. It wasn't about calling out the airline or making a fuss. It was about showing solidarity, about honoring the man's lifetime of service. Taking a deep breath, Captain West stood up from the cockpit, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. He walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. The flight attendants noticed him immediately, their expressions shifting from routine professionalism to curiosity. What was the captain doing? There was something in his stride, something in his manner, that told them this wasn't just a normal check-in. As he approached the front of the cabin, Captain West's eyes found Admiral Grant. He was sitting near the back, his posture relaxed, but his expression distant. The sight of the Admiral, sitting there in the midst of ordinary passengers, struck something deep inside Captain West. He walked up to the front of the cabin and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how the passengers would react, but he knew what he had to do. Clearing his throat softly, Captain West addressed the cabin through the intercom. His voice was calm, firm, but with a quiet respect that immediately captured everyone's attention. The announcement was subtle, but it carried a weight that made every passenger pause and listen. Captain West mentioned that they had an incredibly respected figure on board, Admiral Ezekiel Grant, and acknowledged his years of service to the country. The words hung in the air, and a sense of respect washed over the cabin. The passengers, who had been chatting or lost in their own thoughts just moments ago, now looked around, some even craning their necks to get a glimpse of the Admiral. The flight attendants exchanged glances, some of them visibly moved by the captain's words. Captain West's gesture wasn't a loud one, and it wasn't meant to steal the spotlight. But it was enough. Enough for the passengers to realize that something bigger than just a seating mistake was at play. Admiral Grant, though, remained still, his eyes closing for a moment as he absorbed the unexpected gesture. It wasn't a dramatic change in the situation, but it was enough to shift the dynamic. The passengers, now fully aware of the Admiral's presence, felt the gravity of what had been done, what had been taken for granted. And in the quiet that followed, Captain West knew he had done the right thing. But he wasn't finished yet. There was more to come. "You said." The cabin was filled with a deep, almost reverent silence as the captain's announcement lingered in the air. It wasn't just the mention of Admiral Ezekiel Grant's name that captured the attention of the passengers. It was the simple, quiet acknowledgement of his years of service and dedication. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing for the first time the gravity of the situation. What had initially seemed like a small oversight, a simple seat assignment error, was now recognized as something far more significant. Admiral Grant, seated near the back of the plane, had closed his eyes briefly, taking in the captain's words. He wasn't one to seek attention or recognition. He had spent his life leading quietly, letting his actions speak for him rather than his words. And yet there was something different about this moment. It wasn't about the seat he had been denied. It was about the respect that Captain West had just shown. It was about something larger than just himself. For a fleeting moment, Grant felt a shift, a recognition not only from the captain but from the people around him. Meanwhile, Captain West was standing at the front of the plane, looking around the cabin, his gaze landing on Admiral Grant. He could see the subtle shift in the passengers' behavior. They weren't just whispering anymore. They were observing, taking in what had happened. Captain West hadn't expected applause or overt recognition, but the looks on the faces around him told him that his small gesture had made an impact. What was even more surprising to him was how the passengers were reacting, how they had started to notice not just the Admiral's rank, but the inherent injustice of what had transpired. But Captain West wasn't done yet. There was still more to do. He knew that simply acknowledging the Admiral wasn't enough. It was one thing to mention his name and highlight his service, but it was something entirely different to show true respect. He made his decision. If the system wouldn't give Admiral Grant the respect he deserved, he would. If no one else was going to act, then Captain West would. He straightened his uniform, then walked out of the cockpit and made his way down the aisle toward the Admiral. He moved with purpose, but there was a calmness in his stride, a sense of resolve. As he neared the Admiral's seat, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. The flight attendants seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. No one had anticipated this turn of events, but they were all drawn in now, waiting for the next chapter in the story. When Captain West reached Admiral Grant's seat, he paused for just a moment, looking down at the man who had given so much to his country. He was still seated quietly, as he had been throughout the flight. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet strength about him. The captain took a deep breath and then, in a calm, steady voice, addressed the Admiral. "Admiral Grant," Captain West said, his voice clear but soft enough that only those around them could hear. "I think you deserve more than this." Without waiting for a response, Captain West moved to the seat beside him and sat down. The gesture was simple but profound. He wasn't asking for attention, nor was he making a statement. He was simply showing respect for the man sitting next to him. It was an act of solidarity, an acknowledgement that even in this small moment, the Admiral's sacrifices were worthy of more. The cabin was still, the passengers unsure of how to react. Some of them exchanged surprised glances, while others whispered quietly among themselves. No one had expected this. It wasn't just the seat that had been taken from Admiral Grant. It was the respect that had been denied him, and Captain West was giving it back. In a world that often overlooked the quiet acts of greatness, this moment was a stark reminder of the value of true leadership. And then, slowly, the murmurs grew louder. The passengers began to applaud, soft at first, then building into a steady rhythm. The applause was not for the captain or the admiral. It was for the gesture, for the recognition of a simple, quiet act of respect. Captain West had made a stand, not with loud words, but with a small, powerful action that spoke louder than any speech could. Admiral Grant, still seated, allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't need it. But as the applause filled the cabin, he felt something stir within him, something that reminded him why he had served in the first place. It wasn't for the accolades or the recognition. It was for moments like this, where humanity found a way to stand together and do what was right. The applause echoed through the cabin, soft at first, like a ripple in still water, but growing steadily as the passengers realized the weight of the moment. Admiral Grant, who had spent much of his life in the shadows of his service, was now the center of attention, but not in the way he had ever imagined. The applause wasn't just for his rank or his past accomplishments. It was a quiet acknowledgement of his dignity and the respect he deserved. Captain West, sitting beside him, looked around at the passengers with a calm expression, his small gesture having already done more than words could ever accomplish. He had never expected such a reaction, but he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. He had simply done what he felt was right, without thinking of the consequences. And yet, here in this moment, the passengers had recognized the power of standing up for what was just, no matter how small the act might seem. As the last few claps faded away, the mood in the cabin shifted. What had once been a simple flight had now become something more. A shared experience, a moment of connection. The passengers who had been absorbed in their own worlds just hours ago now shared a bond that had been forged by this unexpected event. The recognition of Admiral Grant's service and the captain's act of respect had sparked something in everyone aboard. It was a reminder that sometimes respect didn't come from titles or positions, but from the simple acknowledgement of what was right. Admiral Grant, sitting quietly beside Captain West, couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He hadn't wanted this attention, but the way the passengers had responded to the captain's actions made him realize that perhaps respect wasn't always something you had to fight for. Sometimes it was about letting others see the worth in you, even when you didn't ask for it. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of recognition, and though it was unexpected, it was deeply moving. The flight attendants, who had been silently observing the scene, began to move through the cabin with renewed energy. Some of them exchanged smiles with the passengers, their expressions filled with pride. They had witnessed something rare on this flight, an act of respect that wasn't dictated by status or rank, but by a shared understanding of what it meant to honor someone's worth. The journey ahead still seemed long, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had been a tense, almost uncomfortable flight had transformed into something meaningful. The conversations that followed the applause were different now. People weren't just talking about the flight. They were talking about the act of respect that had unfolded. There was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before, a quiet understanding that sometimes the smallest gestures had the greatest impact. Captain West, feeling a quiet satisfaction, looked over at Admiral Grant. The man had remained composed, as he always did, but there was something different in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that the world hadn't forgotten about him. As the captain sat there, his mind wandered back to his decision to sit next to the Admiral. It hadn't been for recognition, or for any sort of grand gesture. He had simply done it because it felt like the right thing to do. And in that moment, the passengers had understood that. They had seen through the ranks and the titles and had recognized the value of standing up for one another. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just a simple act of solidarity. And that was enough. The flight continued on, but for everyone aboard, the rest of the journey was different. The quiet hum of the engines no longer felt like a mere background noise. It was a reminder of the connection they had shared, of the brief moment where they had all chosen to stand together, silently, but powerfully, to honor what was right. As the hours passed and the flight continued its journey across the sky, the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged with a sense of unity and respect. The passengers, many of whom had once been unaware of the significance of Admiral Grant's presence, now seemed to view the situation with a deeper understanding. Conversations that had once been filled with small talk or idle chatter now held a new weight. People discussed leadership, respect, and the value of acknowledging the sacrifices others had made. They didn't just talk about the Admiral's service. They talked about what it meant to stand by someone when it mattered, no matter their rank or position. Captain West sat in his seat beside Admiral Grant, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't someone who sought praise or attention, but even he couldn't deny the way the energy had shifted on the plane. It was as if the entire cabin had come together to share a moment of understanding, a moment that would stay with them long after the flight was over. It wasn't just about one man's seat being wrongfully taken or about an act of defiance from a pilot. It was about the recognition of what it meant to treat others with dignity, no matter who they were. The two men sat in silence for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. Admiral Grant's mind wandered back to his years of service, his time spent leading soldiers, strategizing battles, and negotiating peace treaties. He had always believed that leadership wasn't about standing in front of others, demanding respect. It was about earning it through actions, through consistency, and through integrity. And yet, here he was, in the back of a plane, receiving a form of recognition that he had never expected. It wasn't the kind of attention he had sought, but there was something deeply humbling about it. Captain West, too, was reflecting on the events of the past few hours. His gesture had been simple, almost instinctive. It hadn't been about making a statement. It had simply felt like the right thing to do. But as the applause died down and the passengers settled back into their routines, he realized that the impact of his small action would linger far longer than he could have imagined. He wasn't just the pilot. In that moment, he had become a symbol of what it meant to do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. The flight attendants continued their duties, but their movements were more fluid now, less hurried. They smiled at the passengers with a kind of warmth that hadn't been there before. It was as if the entire atmosphere had shifted into something more compassionate, more understanding. The usual routines of serving food and drink were still being followed, but there was a newfound sense of connection in the cabin. The flight attendants no longer seemed like people who simply went through the motions. They seemed like active participants in a shared experience. As the flight progressed, Admiral Grant and Captain West began talking quietly, the conversation flowing easily between them. They didn't discuss anything particularly groundbreaking. It was a casual chat about leadership, service, and the state of the world. But there was a sense of mutual respect that underpinned every word they spoke. For Admiral Grant, it was a rare chance to connect with someone who understood the weight of responsibility, someone who had their own leadership role, even if it wasn't the same as his. For Captain West, it was an opportunity to speak with someone whose wisdom and experience far outstripped his own, someone who had seen more than he could imagine. By the time the plane began its descent toward its destination, the two men had forged a quiet bond, a bond formed not through grand speeches or formal meetings, but through a shared recognition of each other's humanity. The passengers, too, were affected by the interaction. Many of them had witnessed something important, something that reminded them of the importance of kindness, respect, and standing up for what is right. It wasn't about the seat or the wrong that had been done. It was about the way they had all come together in that moment to acknowledge a simple truth, that every person, no matter their status or position, deserves to be treated with dignity. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt signs flickered off, the passengers began to gather their belongings, their faces reflecting a mix of gratitude and contemplation. What had started as an ordinary flight had transformed into something more meaningful. They had all been a part of something that had reminded them of the power of respect, not just for those with authority, but for every person, everywhere. And though they would soon go their separate ways, the impact of that quiet act of solidarity would stay with them, a silent reminder of the importance of doing what is right, even in the smallest of moments. As the plane finally touched down on the runway, the familiar sound of the wheels meeting the tarmac seemed to signal the end of an extraordinary journey, not just for the aircraft, but for everyone aboard. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered off, and the steady hum of the engines quieted, but the energy in the cabin was still alive with a quiet intensity. Passengers who had once been engrossed in their own worlds now stood, gathered their belongings, and began filing toward the exit, but there was a noticeable shift in the air. A subtle understanding had settled over the passengers, one that couldn't be shaken by a simple change in altitude or the end of a flight. Admiral Grant stood slowly, adjusting his uniform as he prepared to disembark. He had long learned to carry himself with dignity, no matter the circumstances, but there was something different in the way the other passengers looked at him as they walked past. It wasn't admiration or sympathy, but something much more genuine, a silent acknowledgement of who he was and what he had contributed. The smiles and nods he received felt sincere, and he found himself returning them with a quiet nod of his own. The world outside the plane was full of chaos and noise, but in that moment, inside the aircraft, there was peace, a peace that came from understanding and shared respect. Captain West, who had watched the Admiral rise from his seat, felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. His action had been small in the grand scheme of things, just a simple decision to sit beside a man who had earned far more than a first-class seat. Yet the ripple effects of that decision had been far-reaching. The passengers had seen something they hadn't expected, and in doing so, they had experienced a shift in perspective. They had witnessed something powerful, an act of solidarity that transcended rank, status, and the expectations of society. It was a reminder that leadership wasn't about who had the most power or the most influence. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. As the Admiral and Captain made their way off the plane together, the flight attendants offered them parting smiles. They had witnessed the transformation too. What had started as a typical mundane flight had turned into something far more meaningful. The staff had seen firsthand how a simple, kind gesture could have an impact that rippled through an entire cabin of strangers. In a world often defined by efficiency and systems, the flight had become a rare opportunity to recognize the human side of leadership and respect. It wasn't about a seat. It wasn't about being in the front of the plane. It was about recognizing someone's worth, no matter where they sat. The journey had come to an end, but the lessons learned would last much longer. For Admiral Grant, the quiet recognition he had received was more than just a moment of fleeting applause. It was a reminder that even in the smallest, most ordinary moments, people could come together to do what was right. For Captain West, it was a lesson in leadership, not defined by titles, but by action. It was about standing by someone when the world seemed indifferent, about offering support when it was needed most. And for the passengers, it was a moment that would stay with them, reminding them that sometimes the most significant moments of their lives were the quiet ones, those that happened without fanfare but carried the most weight. As they all walked through the terminal, the crowd seemed like a blur, but in the back of their minds, each person carried the memory of what had happened on the plane. It was a story they would likely tell in passing, but it would leave a lasting mark on their hearts. A simple flight had turned into a shared experience of human dignity and respect, a small but powerful reminder that we all deserve to be treated with kindness and understanding. And for the Admiral and the Captain, this moment, small as it may have seemed, had restored something in them both. They had found solidarity, even in a world that often overlooked it. It had been a moment where the weight of service, sacrifice, and respect were acknowledged, not in grand gestures, but in a shared moment of humanity.